Good afternoon, everybody. I want to welcome you once more to this seminar for week 7. And the title of our subject today is Power and Its Discontents. So, looking at the objectives of our study today is firstly we're going to talk about how power is applied to our daily lives and how does it affect our health. And also we look at some of the systems of power in a liberal democratic society such as South Africa. We're going to try and identify examples of institutions that transmit this kind of power to individuals and how it influences their behavior. We'll also reflect on the extent to which health responds to the lineaments of power. And finally, we'll also consider the internalized nature of power. So, to start with, I'm going to play a video just to explain or just to give us an idea of what power is, power, knowledge, and how they are related. There's a common saying that knowledge is power. So, how does that affect our lives and our well-being? So, just it's a brief video. Just pay attention. Okay, so one of the key lessons from that video basically is that for power to successfully be implemented to the subject is that it must be packaged in an invisible manner. It must be invisible. And so this is how, for example, knowledge is imparted into our lives from the time we are born, through, for example, care at home, at school, creche, and as we grow, information is imparted into us in an invisible way. But however, that knowledge that we acquire, it molds us into certain behavior and subjects. Okay, so having said that, it's important that we look at a few key words that are important in this subject that will help us unravel the subject and to be able to understand the subject much better. The first one is a structure. Basically, the word structure is a relatively stable social relationship within which human life appears to be conducted. Meaning, there's a form of structures that bring people together, which assembles people together in a certain, community, and so forming a structure. And this can be an ensemble or an institution, for example. Monarchy is one structure where people come together from various countries, others local, from various communities to come and acquire knowledge, and so forth. So we have many structures. Family can be a structure as well. The next word is episteme. Basically, this word means the way we actually acquire knowledge. The way we acquire knowledge is important in the sense that how we acquire it determines basically how we are subjected. For example, given in the same discourse, family discourse, there are family discourses in various, for example, in a given country, we have many families in communities. How each family behaves is different because of the micro forces that operate in each family, based on the knowledge that they have acquired so far. Knowledge about, for example, norms and values of family. And these vary also from country to country. The next is discourse. Of course, we have discussed this term before. Discourse is the way of being, or the way life unfolds. And it also encompasses, language, for example, how we speak, ways of being in the world. For example, if you want to be a woman, or if you are a woman, you behave in a certain way, different from a man, and etc. So, this is highly influenced by the environment in which we are brought in and the knowledge that we acquire. The next term is subject. Well, I think we've talked about this terminology before. We are all subjects to various discourses. So, a subject basically is a social individual, one who is put together socially via the effects of discourse. At any given time, any given day, we may assume more than one set of discourses. You can be a student in a learning discourse or learning environment. From there, you can be, when you go home, you find yourself in a family discourse. In the family discourse, you are subjected to different forces that influence your behavior at home, which is different from that which is at campus, for example. So, the subject is the social institution. If you look at various social institutions, actually, they have certain powers that influence our behavior in those institutions. If you belong to a club, for example, it's a social institution, and the way you behave in a club is different from the way you behave at home. It's also different from the way you behave in other social settings. So the subject is constantly subjected to discursive forces and influences. Meaning, as subjects, we are constantly subjected to situations, environments, or discursive forces. Environments which have got certain force behind it, which influence our behavior. I'll give you an example. In a class environment, for example, you are forced to behave in a certain way because of the regulations that are put on Monash, how students must behave in class and outside. So the way you behave in the class is different from the way you behave outside the class within the same institution. For example, you cannot come into class wearing bikini because it's immoral. It's not acceptable. But if you wear bikini at the beach, it's acceptable. No one will laugh or no one will raise an eye. And then as a subject is derived or formed through coercive forces, sometimes persuasive forces, prodding forces, and sometimes it's managed via power. This power is usually transmitted through discourse. So there can be various ways in which power is actually subjected onto the subject, individuals, in order to form that social individual. It can be coercive, persuasive, or prodding, etc. So let's look at the word discourse, and especially in relation to morality. Now, this is a subject that has been widely studied by the philosophers which we have dealt with before. Michel Foucault, he's done a lot of research. He did a lot of research on this, and his research was highly influenced by Nietzsche. Nietzsche is another philosopher that did a lot of work in the similar subject. One of Nietzsche's major works was the genealogy of morality. Meaning, how does morality come about? For example, what is considered moral in Monash environment? How did that come about? Monash has acquired certain moral values which are influenced, for example, by the Department of Education in South Africa, which have laid rules on how higher learning institutions must conduct themselves. So, and within Monash, you have morals that operate in class, at class level. So, there is that genealogy right from the government going into each institutions. From the institutions, there are powers that subject people or to behave in a certain manner, or moralities that are delivered unto the subjects at the grassroots. So, genealogy of morality basically is an account of ways in which human society is subjected to restraint and constraint through moral forces. Basically, these forces are the power in other ways. So, there are many powers that are forces, many powers that are at work, which influence our moral values. There are moral values in each institution that we find ourselves. At home, we have different moral values. At work, we have different moral values. At school, we have different moral values. And these values, basically, these are powers acting through social norms and expectations. Meaning, in a given institution, in a given discourse, there are certain social norms and expectations that are expected out of you, out of each and every one of us. And we know how to behave in everyone because of the knowledge that we have acquired. We have learned somehow. And quite often these social norms and expectations are derived through religion and morals. So this basically religion has many bases for these moral social norms. And here is the pictures of these two guys. On the left is Michel Foucault, and on the right is Nietzsche. So, more about morality. Basically, morality is the way to power, masquerading as the way to truth. So basically, it's power which is embedded in what is called truth. Because what we call norms and values is based on certain truths. However, within those truths, it carries power that influences our behavior in different, environments, in different discourses. So, morality is a system of social order which effectively represses people's capacity for individual action and makes it subject to discipline. Yes, meaning that morality basically creates some form of social order, and this order basically it represses people's capacity to express their individual desires. For example, when you are in any given discourse, in any institution, you cannot express, you can't do whatever you want to do. This is what basically it means. It represses your behavior to conform to the norms and values of that discourse, of that institution, of that society, of that family, for example. And this kind of social norms and morality basically is all rooted in religious beliefs, because religion plays a major role in how these social norms are derived. So let's talk more about discourse as an assemblage. So discourse basically can either operate positively and negatively, meaning that it can encourage or repress a given discourse or institution or community based on the values, normal values, can encourage someone to do something or enjoy life and be vibrant and be progressive and develop. However, there are certain discourses that may operate in a negative manner, hence repress an individual's capacity to do anything. So, it also operates at micro level, meaning that discourse does not only talk about large institutions, but it also about family life. Think about all the family lives, for example. So you have family life, each one has a family life. We are all in South Africa, but if you look at each family, if you look at the forces that operate in each family, they are different. The way the individuals or the subjects in those families operate and behave, the norms under which they are subjected, is different from family to family. Yet we are all subjected to the larger community of South Africa. For example, Gauteng. So what I'm saying is that we have, discourses that operate at micro level. You can also think about school life and all the school lives. For example, children who are at one school, may behave differently from children that are at another school, because at that school there are forces behind, those schools. The behavior of the children at that school may be different, although all these schools operate under the same Department of Education, and they are given standards and rules on how to operate these schools. Also, in fact, you can also think about the hospitals, factories, offices, universities, and police forces. So, yeah, this is just to elaborate that discourse is not only at the macro level, but also it can operate at micro level. So it's not so much of what they do, but what and how they are. How, for example, families are. How, for example, schools are. Why are schools different? Why are families different? Why are hospitals different? Yet they operate under same regulations. So these forces that differentiate these hospitals, schools, families, actually play a huge role in the behavior of the subject. So let's now look at the self and the subject. So if you look at the self, which is us as individuals, we are subjects, meaning we get subjected to various forces depending on the discourse where we are. The question is, how do we for example, how do we behave differently? How do we know how to behave differently in each discourse? How do we know what we are? It's a good question. We are because of certain forces, right from the time we were born to the time when we grow, where we are right now as adults. There have been so many forces that have worked on us or operated on us to be who we are. And this is why we are different, because we're born from different families, taken to different schools, different hospitals, different factories, shops, and different lives. And so, the next question, are we always the same? The question is no. We are not always the same. We are different when we're in a class environment, for example. And we are different when we are out of the class and yet in the Monash, grounds. We are different when you leave Monash and we are at Featherbrook. Or if we are, we are at home, we are different. What are the dominant forces on our lives, and what were the dominant forces on those dominant forces? So this is a question basically for us to interrogate and think about the various dominant forces that are at play in our lives that influence our differential behaviors in different discourses. And what are those dominant forces on those dominant forces? For example, I gave an example on forces that operate at Monash to control our behavior. They are also dominant forces on forces that exist on Monash. For example, from our community, from the Department of Higher Education, etc. Within the family, there are forces. For example, the parents have, some force, exert some force on their children. And the parents also receive some forces from external forces. For example, from the government, from the parents are forced to take care of the children in a certain way, to bring up their children in a certain acceptable way. And there are rules to that. They cannot abuse the children. They cannot bring the children out of the social norms, out of the acceptable norms, values, and morals, and so forth. So, the other point is that this archive of personal subjectification is very personal. Meaning that this way of personal this way of individual subjectification actually is personal, in the sense that each individual is exposed or is subjected by an array of different forces. Given two individuals within the family, they cannot have exactly the same forces, on their lives, because these forces actually, they mold our behavior. They mold the outcome of our behavior eventually. But given two individuals within the same family, you find that there are different forces. For example, within a given family, one may go to a different school. And just by going to different schools, one may go into different classes. Just by going into different classes, one is exposed to different forces. And that all put together, it makes who you are. And that's why it's so personal. The question now is, why aren't we all the same? This is why I was explaining this. Why we are not the same is because we are exposed to different forces, both at micro and macro levels, macro discourses. Let me now talk about regulation, because this term is very important. There are ways in which our subjects or our behavior are regulated. For example, the prisons and the police, they exert some form of regulation. The law and the order are what is also called correctives. There are supervisory structures. In their nature, the aim is to regulate people's behavior. Those who behave outside the morals, out of the given morals, out of this acceptable norms and values, outside the morality of the community, usually are isolated from the community. Meaning, for example, no one is supposed to kill another person. No one is supposed to beat or steal from another person. If you do so, the police will arrest you and you will be taken to prison, which means that your freedom is actually restricted because you have behaved outside the morals. So this is why this is an important part. Regulation is an important terminology in this subject, in order to understand exactly how power is used to influence our behavior and eventually our health and well-being. But where does a real social order come from? So it's important also to interrogate this question. Sit down and or make an introspection. Where does all this social order come from? Who makes them? Who is behind all these orders to determine who we are and how we should be? This is a big question, in the sense that there are forces that operate at higher level. For example, UN has been given the mandate to influence social order through various agencies, through the WHO, for example, which have got certain guidelines frameworks which are imposed on countries to obey and to fulfill. The WHO, not only this, there's also FAO, UNICEF. All these are agencies through which UN operates. It has got some force. It provides some form of regulations. Those institutions help to regulate countries, to mold them, and in so doing, you see that actually there are at times that those norms or those guidelines are breached, are not followed. In the same way that, for example, UN is supposed to bring peace, UN actually may not be able to bring peace. For example, there is an example of Syria. Syria, all the forces in the world have been involved to trying to bring social order. But there is no social order. The question is why? America has sent troops. Russia has sent troops. Some neighboring countries like Turkey, have sent troops to go and bring law and order. Yet, there's no law and order. The question is, where does real social order come from? So this is a very important question that we need to ask ourselves, where it comes from. And effective social order. How can effective social order come about? As we saw in the video earlier, in order for power to be dominant and to have an effective effect, and to be effective on the community, it must be packaged in an invisible manner. Meaning the way you exercise your power must not show the subject that you have this power over them. But it must come in a manner that looks as if you are very much concerned about them, you love them, and you want them to change. So, if you use force, quite often you cannot achieve that social order because the individuals are likely to rebel and reject. Okay, so again, when you look at regulation, there's an example where, for example, is a question why are Bondi or Bela so different? Okay, these are two distinctive places in Australia. Bondi is an iconic beach in Australia, and the Bela is a pleasure resort where there are a number of social activities such as museums and gymnasiums and the gardens and things like that. So the two are different. The question is, why are they different? The point is that if you look at Bondi, the way people express themselves when they're at the Bondi beach is way different when the same people are actually exposed to Bela. When they're at the beach, they take off their clothes and they are not ashamed to show their body structure. They are in their bikini and their little shorts, etc. But when the same people find themselves in a place like Bela, they'll be well dressed. They'll be dressed differently. The question is, why? They are what we call internalized discursive norms. The self regulates itself. Meaning, the same person knows, well, this is now Bondi Beach. It's time to open up. It's time to take off the clothes and relax. No, if you look at people, you don't even look at them in a sexual way. You don't have, because if someone came with a bikini in class, for example, it's going to trigger a lot of different reactions from people. You can imagine that. But if you go to the beach, the way people are looked at the beach despite wearing bikinis does not trigger the same reaction as when people wear bikinis in class, for example, or in a shopping mall. This is all because of that internalized discursive norms. We know within ourselves that there are certain things we cannot do in certain areas. And how do we achieve this? We draw on the archive of discursive forces in order to do so. So they are archive discursive forces that enable us. For example, there are forces internalized discursive norms or forces, which we know wherever we are, we draw from them, knowing that, okay, here is, in this kind of environment, this is the type of acceptable standards. So you self-regulate yourself on what kind of behavior, what to say, what to eat, what to do, etc. And then let's look at the government, at government level. Of course, the government provides the space where positive and negative dimensions of power come together. Okay? And as you know, the government may provide, for example, for a given action, it may reward, and for certain actions, it may actually discipline or punish. So the same government is capable of doing both. So the government basically is a discursive space for cohesion and self-regulation. Okay? This is where the negative force is disciplined, and the positive force is self-regulation. And self-regulation generally of desire for productive purposes. Generally, the aim of all these positive and negative dimensions of power by the government is for productive purposes. People must be productive. If they are out of their norms or standards, they need to be brought to the book. They need to be regulated. They need to be taught how to behave. They need to be disciplined. Okay. So, now, if we look at modern societies are dynamic. It means that they are changing rapidly. They are not static. If you look at the norms and values, they are changing at a rapid rate. If you look at how we treat children in homes, it's changing. The rules of how to discipline children is changing over time. Spanking, it was there before, 20, 30 years ago. Now you cannot spank your own children. It's not allowed. Spanking is not allowed in schools. When I grew up, we were spanked both at home and at school. So you can see that all these regulations and powers in societies are changing. But this change is not simply repressive. Power originally requires repression, and it didn't matter who the king was. Okay, so if basically we look at modern society basically is the originally power was exercised or was implemented through repression with the use of force. And it did not matter who the king was. For example, take William and Mary, meaning King William and Queen Mary, for instance. Both grandchildren of King James I. They became co-rulers of Britain in 1688 after Parliament dumped King James II, for being too pro-Catholic. Okay, and they didn't even speak English, but they were both accepted as kings and queen. They were Protestant, and so because of that they were so acceptable. Because in Great Britain at that time, if you were pro-Catholic, you were despised, and because they were Protestants, and as you know, Protestants, they broke away from Catholic and were more liberal, and so because of that they were accepted. Why are we talking about this? It means that society is dynamic, it's changing, and also that rulers are ciphers. Rulers are ciphers. What we can learn from the previous example is that they are powers that influence the behavior of rulers, behavior of kings, presidents, prime ministers, which means that it does not really depend on the type of ruler. It's not about, for example, Jacob Zuma in South Africa. That will determine the outcome of the presidency. If you look at the Jacob Zuma, and for example, we had before we had Mutkantre and we had Thabo Mbeki. Now we have a different president, Cyril Ramaphosa. Can you see that if you look at they are different individuals, but if you look at the outcome of the presidency, it doesn't vary significantly. Meaning, if you look at rulers, basically, one is as good as the next. So it does not really depend on the individual. It depends on the powers that are at play. The regulations on how they're supposed to behave. The rules of the game. The real ruler is power itself. So the power that they hold rules them, forces them to behave in the way they do. This is why they cannot express their individual desires in the individual opinion. They are forced to operate based on the power that they've been given. And this power is in pursuit of some social order, some form of order. And we talk about this power. Power is in 3 forms, probably 4 forms. We have repressive power, biopower, pastoral power, and plus final power. Quickly, let's look at repressive power. This is power to control. Basically, you control people through repression. You repress their behavior. They cannot express their internalized behavior, their desires. They are forced to comply, to behave in the way you want them to. Okay. And then Machiavellian or preemptive. This is another form of control, where basically you control people through fear of death, for example. And for example, where you have dictators, the dictators are able to maintain power because they can take your life at any time. There's no rule. There's no rule of law. There's no order. Whatever they say goes. For example, the power of police and prisons is basically a repressive power. Power of structures working on the body to constrain, restrain, and control physicality. So, okay, let's look at biopower. Okay, biopower basically is power that aims at controlling the population, societies, communities, using scientific ways of controlling people. Here, science and techniques of disciplining whole society in pursuit of stable and health subjects is at play. And usually these power techniques which are useful for production. And for example, you have armies, and that's the extension of power. Armies are there to provide security to a nation so that there's peace, law, and order. And biopower, these control mechanisms through science and techniques of discipline, works on the subject, but as a member of the broader population. So it does not subjectify, it does not affect individuals per se, but this is power that is subjected to communities, larger communities, broader communities, population, so to say. And of course, we have pastoral power. This is another form of self-regulating power, meaning that, you behave, or your behavior must be in conformity to given norms. Norms, for example, morality, sin, guilty, and pleasure. Once you have this kind of teaching, pastoral teaching, you are actually allowed to, through that power of teaching, pastoral teaching, you self-regulate by observing the moral values, by avoiding sin, because sin is seen as against God's will and is punishable. And also you are highly sensitive to guilt and also to pleasure. How you express yourself in terms of pleasure must be done according to certain norms. So this pastoral power basically is power that is developed through the church. As pastors and evangelists, they teach the word of God, teach Christian morals, whatever religious morals, which aim to bring peace and tranquility in communities. Okay, and then you have pastoral powers also. These are powers that actually are changing over time. The new salvation is not spiritual or heavenly. The new salvation is based on something else, because if you look at the teachings of religious teachings over time, the emphasis of religious teachings are changing. For example, in Christianity and in many other forms of religion, because of poverty, there's so much focus on how, as Christians, we can obtain financial freedom, how we can overcome financial difficulties, how we can overcome sickness and disease. Not so much on salvation. So the first emphasis on salvation has been, reduced. But the pursuit of hygiene, productivity, good health, and social stability has been increased, and this is why, if you see in most of these churches where the congregations are very, speak, quite often it's as a result of the promise that those prophets, evangelists, or whatever, they promise to people. If they promise healing, you see a lot of people flocking there. If they promise financial prosperity, and many people are drawn to such kind of churches. Okay, then next is phenopower. Basically, this is power that is derived through financial capacity, based on the financial capacity. So basically, this is the power of capitalist financial arrangement. The way the capitalist financial model has been arranged is such that having money is like having power. There is power attached to money. The more you have money, the more power you have. For example, to live a certain way, to obtain certain things. Now the question is, does money have a logic? Is there any logic to money? Yes, there is some form of logic to money, in the sense that money enables you to obtain literally anything. You can't live without money. But it's been arranged in a manner that you have to work for it. You have to do certain things in order to obtain money. And why is it that certain people have money, others do not have? It's the entire capitalist, financial arrangement has been made such that, others are dominantly rich than others. And in so doing, they make money over the poor. They are able to dominate the communities and influence life, influence the financial setups, make more money out of the poor. What is it? How does it operate? What is money and how it operates? This is an interesting question. What is its discipline and its power? These are very important questions to ask about money and how it influences. I can talk at length about money and how it has influenced our behavior, and why, for example, people are willing to give up their bodies just for money. People are willing to give up their spouses, their children. Why, for example, there is child trafficking, human trafficking. It's all because of money. Why people are willing to go at length to actually kill other people just for money. So there's a lot of money has got a certain form of power. If you look at it, dissect it further, you see that power can either be used in a positive way or a negative way. Okay, so let's quickly look at the institutions as a fluxes, as a flux. So here when I say flux, basically institutions as a conduit of power. Institutions as an element that transmits power to individuals. So when we look at institutions, basically they are not quite as solid as they used to be. Institutions have changed over time, and how much they can transmit and influence that power on the individuals has also changed over time. There is constant changing and modifying of institutions, and this involves changing of processes and relationships rather than the structure. The structure is still the same, but it's just the processes within these institutions and the relations. If we talk about, for example, family, as an institution. And this is a question, this is an example which I often give. For example, if you look at the family as an institution, 50 years ago, people were not allowed to cohabit. People were not, it was not allowed to bear children out of wedlock. Children were given as a result of a marriage. And this is marriage between men and women. And now we can see that governments can now allow gay marriages. So you see, over time, these institutions have changed. The processes and relations have changed. The family institution still the same. Okay. So what it means is that these institutions basically they are totally adaptable to specific situations. So how these processes and relations are shaped and how they are shaped, and is really another question that we need to consider and think about. How does, we spoke about, for example, how South Africa adopted a gay marriage policy and put laws in place. Who determined this as a problem, and what discursive forces were at play to influence policy implementation? So if you look at these important questions, you realize that actually sometimes there are vested interests that are at play to influence policy change in a direction, in a selfish direction. Because in a Christian nation like, in a religious nation like South Africa, where 80% of population is Christian, how do you find it's mind-boggling to realize that a country like South Africa can actually adopt a gay marriage policy when majority of the people actually do not believe in such, because they are religious, and it's against the marriage, such kind of relationships, which are considered to be immoral. They are considered to be evil. It's a sin. As a Christian, the Bible says gay relationship and marriage is a sin. So again, it's not so much about at how they change, but who changes them. Who is behind changing of those processes is what matters a lot. Again, institutional dynamics. The institutions of governments are not themselves separate and authoritative. So, what it means basically is that government is not separate, is not isolated and separate in the sense that they themselves, reflect the micro institutions of power and governance that operate throughout the society. So what government has done is to break down into small institutions, government departments, and within these government departments, they have institutions, for example, in Department of Health, you have, you have community health centers, you have clinics, you have, after clinics, you have tertiary hospitals. All these levels of institutions actually is is how government influences its power on the society, on the community. So from the society, how they operate from bottom up is from the community. If you are sick, you go to a community health center. If they can't handle the matter, they will refer to a tertiary hospital, etc. And then also is that, being government institutions, these institutions actually at various communities, they self-regulated. The rulers are constructed by self-discipline practices of the ruled, meaning that, there are major rules that you have to follow from the top that influence the rulers at various community levels. And the question is also, if you look at the way the government, how we select rulers from communities into the government, and these same government people actually make laws, and the laws which actually aimed at they promise to punish us. For example, if you look at within a given locality, you may elect a member of parliament. He goes to parliament. He's given the portfolio to develop or to establish policies and the laws that aim to restrict our freedoms to operate within the certain society norms. But if we do not operate according to those social norms, we are punished by being arrested, by being fined, or by being arrested and taken to prison by the same people that we elected into parliament. So then that brings us to the regimes of power. So if you look at the regimes of power, basically there are different types of powers, and which reflect different ways of constructing the subject. So if you look at the different regimes of power, these powers are basically contingent, in the sense that these powers, they work at different institutions depending on the circumstances which developed over time, and the content of the archive, content of the past. So looking at the past and looking at all the forces that are constantly working on those institutions, these powers actually are changing over time. And then within these regimes of power, you have powers that utilize subtle, distinct ways of being. And this basically can be explained by the fact that these powers are derived from local attempts to address local constraints to power, meaning that from the bottom up, you have these regimes of power at various levels, community levels, society levels, national levels, etc. And if you look at the way these powers are derived, usually they are derived based on the local constraints, the local situations to power. But all these powers are always aimed at pursuing power, order, and control, depending at rather at various levels. You find the aim of the power is to exert order and control. And the power also just to let me just leave it there. Let's move on to the next, agency. Agency basically is the capacity to act autonomously, meaning that if in any given an agency is an organization or an institution that is given autonomous, has some capacity to act autonomously from the main powers, from the existing powers. So, and then normally that's how agencies are supposed to. So, for example, you can have an agency that is constructed or is formulated, for example, to disperse social welfare funds. Usually these can be non-governmental organizations that are more or less independent, and however they have certain limited independence, in the sense that their aim is they have to carry out the mandate of the government to disperse those funds. How they do it is based on their autonomy, based on their system. They can develop their own system to do that. So it's important to realize that at that level also we have different sort of powers at play. Yet people operate distinctly under identical social conditions, which means that when given an agent, while you are still operating the same social, social conditions, the agencies usually have different freedoms from the rest. And usually it's often creatively. Okay, you can start that more at your own time. You can look at that. What does this all mean? What it all means is that society is endless twisting and turning in pursuit of order. Society is not static, it's dynamic. And how? Because it's constraining us and forming our subjectivity via countless micro power plays. So we spoke about various forms of power plays that influence us, the various institutions. And where does power live now? If we talk about power, where does power come from now? A couple of examples. The first example is the biggest loser. People eat crap and drink it, and do no exercises, and get overweight. Then we objectify a few of them and make a lot of money from the rest. That's another form of power. Someone goes in, we allow, junk food, we allow, sugary drinks. When people get overweight, someone comes in and objectify them and creates a program, the biggest loser, and makes a lot of money out of it. The question is, who is in control? See that basically the next is the popular culture. If you look at the popular culture, who decides who is fat and who is attractive? Who decides? Those are the people who have power. We have magazines, for example. You have seen the magazine the magazine showing women, in slim suits with very slim figures, and those are the people who determine who is fat and who is thin, who is attractive, who is not. And those are the people who have power. Because when people look at such pictures, they are forced to behave in a certain way. They want to lose weight, they want to do this. And then what messages do we get about food and how to be healthy? Those are the messages that actually are fed into our minds and influence our behavior. Not to mention alcohol and drugs, sex, of course. Why is it legal to buy brandy and coke but not ecstasy? So that will tell you exactly, because for example, that if you drink coke, to coke like any other sugary drinks, it's too much sugar, and those sugars eventually you end up having obesity, sugar diabetes for those who are old, etc. Why haven't we not labeled these drinks as bad to our health? Yet when we look at ecstasy is illegal because it has negative adverse effects. Coke has adverse effects as well. So the way the messages are relayed to us is in the manner that actually it controls our behavior. We don't think too much about the consequences of what we eat and drink. That is the way the messages come through to us. Why are opiate users criminalized? And why do Victorian Brewery sponsor cricket teams? These are some of the questions that we need to ask when you look at popular culture. Every successful junk food companies, they want to sponsor cricket, they want to sponsor sports, because by doing that, they want to have good reputation. They want to be seen to be concerned and to concerned about life and work. Yet they are highly involved in destroying people's lives. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our discussion. And of course, this week we already did our presentation. So thank you very much for your attention.